Oh yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
welcome to the beginning of Marx.
Let's go to the beginning of the of the PowerPoint. Okay, so Marx 1, and we're going to concentrate today on theories of value. And this, as always, is the structure of the vodcast. We're going to first of all start with a quite complicated concept, Marxist dialectics, and then move on to the distinction between use value and exchange value, and from there to the objectification of labour, onwards and or upwards to mystification and this idea of commodity fetishism. And then John will take over and talk about
Economy, ecology, class struggle, uselessness, and the real.
right. So in a way, we have a responsibility to Marx's ideas. Jacques Derrida wrote a wonderful book in 1992 called Spectres of Marx, which is precisely about the responsibility and the duty that we carry towards him and his ideas. So I would also, or we would both ask you to keep an open mind and not to already kind of start from the vantage point that capitalism is the only system that ever works, because, well, A, it doesn't work, and B, it's not true. so in a way, we need to think and look at Marx in order to think through and imagine other ways of being in the world. And Marx, what he does in Capital Volume 1, which is the only volume that we'll be looking at in this module, is that he actually works backwards. The first volume is about production. It's written from the standpoint of production, whereas Volume 2, as you can see on the slide, is about exchange. Volume 3 is about crisis formation and rules of distribution. He never finished that third volume. So, and what Marx does in Volume 1 of Capital is that he, as I said, goes backwards. He begins with a very simple idea, which is the idea of the commodity, in order to think, as I said, backwards through the production process. And what he does is he takes his cue from Hegel and the Hegelian dialectic. So the Hegelian dialectic, usually a dialectic is two forces pushing against each other. So you have sort of opposing social forces, let's say. The Hegelian dialectic, you have these two forces and they arrive at a synthesis at the end of it. But in Marx, you have what is the most important thing is the interactive tension between these two forces. Basically, what he's saying is that he's paying attention to the conflict of material forces. This is how Marx interprets politics and the social world. So he's interested in the action of opposing social forces. And these are subjects in a world in relation to a dynamic environment. So history, for example, as a concept, is not something that can be studied in isolation in a static environment, which is something that Hegel would do. But it needs to be considered in an environment of interactions, developments, and transformation. So economic phenomena, which is the point of analysis in Marx's Capital, is again something that cannot be studied in isolation, but in their connection and interaction with and to each other. Okay, so value, fundamental concept in Marx's work. And value is something that does not remain constant and exists only in motion. So it's not something that is inherent in things. Specifically, exchange value can only exist in relation to something else. So use values are only realized in use or in consumption, for example. So use value, obviously, when you're consuming something, but again, it's not something that is inherent in a thing, but it is only realized when it's in motion in a way. The exchange value, as Marx writes, is a form of appearance, a Erscheinungsform of a content that is indistinguishable from it, e.g., it's not trapped in the thing itself. Exchange value, for example, the example that Marx uses is linen. Exchange value is not apparent when you exchange 20 yards of linen for another 20 yards of linen because these two kind of elements are the same. Exchange value exists only if you exchange linen for something that is distinguishable from it, for something other than linen. So value, as Marx says, is something that is defined through labour. And it is, as Marx says, socially necessary labour time. So it means that if you are making a coat, you can't make your coat in your own time. E.g., you can't take a week to do it, but you must do it in the same time that everyone else who are working on coats is also doing their coats. So that is socially necessary labour time. It means it's a defined amount of time that you can spend on making something. So you can't make something in your own time, and you can't take longer than everyone else. All commodities, as Marx says, are definite quantities of congealed labour time. Congealed labour time is this idea that labour is something that becomes trapped in an object, and that is a sort of standard across the board for commodities. Every commodity congeals labour time within itself. This is a sort of abstract human labour, so it's not something that belongs to you, but it is congealed in the commodity. So as a result, as Marx and Engels write in economic and philosophic manuscripts, labour's realisation is its objectification, which means labour becomes a thing. The German Verdinglichkeit, Gegenständlichkeit makes that, I think, clearer. So the worker herself becomes a thing through that process of commodity production. This in turn leads to what Marx calls object bondage. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth she produces, the more his production increases in power and range. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. The increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion to the devaluation of the world of men. Labour produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity. This leads to what Marx calls the reification of the world. So that means the world turning into a thing or a world of things, including living beings turning into things. Capitalism seeks to transform every form of life into labour. It does not allow living beings to simply, justly live. If you're a living being and you can't produce, you're considered to be useless. So labour, and by extension the worker, becomes a commodity. And this is not to say, I mean, Marx actually, I'm not sure if we look at this later on in the other sections that we read from Capital, but for Marx also, the way that life or human life is defined is through labour, but this labour belongs to you. It doesn't belong to the capitalist. What capitalism does is it robs you of your own labour and turns that into a commodity. So if you imagine, for example, that you live in a community, obviously labour is still something that happens, and labour can also still be divided up in this community, and you can exchange these things, but that doesn't mean that they're commodities. Commodities are performed and created only for capitalist benefit, e.g. in order for exchange value to happen. So in a community, you decide, or we decide what we need, but not the capitalist. In capitalist society, you don't make things because you necessarily need them, but because you're looking for exchange value. And you can find, if you take the example of a table, for example, you can find the exchange value in the wood of the table itself, because this table needs to be exchanged for something other than it is. So this commodity then, The division of labour, as we said earlier, is necessary for the production of a commodity, but only the products of mutually independent acts of labour performed in isolation can confront each other as commodities. So these commodities then have what Marx calls a dual nature. They're on the one hand objects of utility and bearers of value, but it is impossible to grasp it as a thing possessing value. So it's again this idea that exchange value is not something that you can see in a table made of wood, for example. It's only something that becomes apparent if this table can be exchanged for something else, usually money. So, this concept of mystification, that kind of arises because precisely you can't exchange linen for linen, you can't exchange a table made of wood for a table made of wood in commodity capitalism. You need to exchange these things for something else, which means that linen needs to be exchanged for money, and linen in that what's the word? Linen in that equation is what Marx calls the relative form of the value, right? So the relative form of the value of linen therefore presupposes that some other commodity confronts it in the equivalent form. So if you want to exchange linen for money, linen is in the relative form of the value and money is in the equivalent form. The product of labour is an object of utility in all states of society. So that goes back to what I said earlier. Labour is what defines, according to Marx, human life, and the product of labour should and often is an object of utility in all states of society, but it is only a historically specific epoch of development which presents the labour expended in the production of a useful article as an objective property of that article, i.e. as a value. It is only then that the product of labour becomes transformed into a commodity. This objective property that Marx is talking about here is the congealed labour that is trapped in a commodity and which is mystified by the production process. So this exchange value has to do with congealed labour. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social behaviour of men's own labour as objective characteristics of the products of labour themselves. It is nothing but the definite social relations between men themselves, which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. Commodity fetishism then, as Marx says, is about congealed labour, and this congealed labour, which is also abstract labour, it is socially necessary labour, is abstracted from the living world. So congealed labour is labour that is abstracted from the living world. And if you pay attention to the metaphors that Marx uses, these are often drawn from the Gothic. He's often talking about the vampirism of capitalism, that the blood of the worker runs through the veins and the body of the capitalist, that capitalism is a lifeless mechanism which is sustained only through the flesh and blood of the worker. And all of this has to do with congealed labour, making us and making both the worker and the labour itself into objects, and turning the world into reified objects, where the only relations you can have are, as Marx says, a relation between things, not a relation between living beings. And the veil, as Marx says, is not removed from the countenance of the social life process, i.e. the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men and stands in their conscious and planned control. So basically, the only way that this is going to change, the only way that the world of things becomes a world of relations between living beings, again, is if we take control of the process of production. So we decide what we need And the process of production is not determined by the abstract forces of consumer capitalism or by things like the market, the invisible hand of the market, but and we don't produce things purely for their exchange value, but because we need them. That's the only way that we can return to a world that is worth living in.
I'm going to make a few connections between the reading from Marx and what Fabienne's just said about that reading and what we've been looking at for the last 3 weeks. So my heading here, Economy and Ecology, obviously brings Marx and Darwin into conjoinment. And I'm going to suggest there are 3 ways we might think of this conjoinment. We might think very obviously straightforwardly of an etymological relationship between economy and ecology, a discursive relationship, and connect to that a conceptual relationship as well. So economy and ecology sound alike, and they come, of course, from the same Greek root, the oikos, which we would translate more usually as household in the context of economy, or habitation in the context of ecology. The words here suggest firstly economy, oikos, the mind, so managing the household, oikonomia, so that is that you're kind of looking after stuff, you're doing kind of weekly budgets, you're organising your world. So that is the force of economy. Oikos, more academic, habitation, and logia, so the study of how we live in the world. So it's how we manage the world or how we live in the world. So there's a relationship but a slight divergence in the etymological roots. Here's the description of what ecology means from Ernst Haeckel, who in 1869, very much in Darwin's period, coins the term ecology in the German. I can't remember. What is the German for ecology?
Actually, I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds very like ecology. But anyway, here's a translation. By ecology, we mean the body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature. And a few of you have picked up in that in Darwin's writing as well. This very widely used term, the economy of nature. The investigation of the total relations of the animal both to its inorganic and to its organic environment, including, above all, its friendly and inimical relations with those animals and plants with which it comes directly and indirectly into contact. In a word, ecology is the study of all those complex interrelations referred to by Darwin as the conditions for the struggle of existence. So a discursive relationship between economy and ecology means that there are similar kinds of rhetorics involved, similar languages, similar ways of expressing the world. So by ecology we mean the body of knowledge concerning the total economy of nature. So there's an overlap between the terms that these larger fields of economy and ecology use. So that's a discursive connection. Connected to that, they both conceive of the world in comparable terms. So that's a conceptual relationship through most obviously the idea of interrelations. The ecology in the Darwinian sense functions through the very complex interrelations between organisms over large periods of time. Ecology in a Marxist sense functions through the dialectical relationships between social classes and the way that objects have labour congealed in them and how those objects perform social relationships as well. So it's another form of complex social interconnection. Some more specific connections here in a passage from The Origin of Species and a passage of Capital. I'll read both of these out and then I will make 4 connections between them. So remind you of this very famous passage. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms into one, and that whilst this planet has gone circling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Marx. The value of a commodity, the linen for example, is now expressed in terms of innumerable other members of the world of commodities. Every other physical commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. The linen, by virtue of the form of value, no longer stands in a social relation with merely one other form of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities as well. as a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the endless series of expressions of its value implies that, from the point of view of the value of the commodity, the particular form of use value in which it appears is a matter of indifference. So there are specific linguistic connections between these two passages. In green, interrelation, the entangled bank, Darwin's phrase, and the innumerable members of the world of commodities that are related to one another through commodity culture. In blue, ideas of value, which is the topic for this week. So value slightly differently in these two views. So value to do with economics and social position, but there are implicitly terms of value in Darwin's aesthetic judgment here as well. A different form of value beyond the economic, the non-material form of value that he forces it to consider at the end of the origin of species. So a value of mind and soul, not of materiality. In yellow, a global reach. So Darwin's theory is a theory of planetary life. Marxism is a theory of capitalism as world system, as it would later be called. So the whole world of commodities and the whole planet of ecological interactions. And finally, in red, this word endless that appears in both Darwin and in Marx there. So it's interesting to think about how Marx and Darwin both envisage history working. So we might think of them both as teleological systems of thought. So we are progressing to the perfection of man, or Marx is progressing towards a revolution of the proletariat. But ironically, in relation to that, we have this sense of kind of circling and endlessness, a continuity that cannot be ended as a key part of their philosophies. Perhaps most obviously the idea of struggle. I won't say much about this at all. We've touched on this in class, but Origin of Species is subtitled The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. Marxism is the history, rests on the contention that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. We might ask ourselves later in the semester what kind of struggles are pertinent to the Freud's philosophy as well. Fabian touched on uselessness. Every form of life must be transformed into labour in order for it to be take its significance in that economic system. So the idea of uselessness provides a radical challenge to both Darwinian and Marxist thought, because it indicates a kind of radical disalignment from the system. If a thing is useless, so is the labour contained in it. The labour does not count as labour and therefore creates no value. So uselessness is unassimilable into the system of capital. In not entirely dissimilar terms, the acquisition of a useless part can hardly be said to raise an organism in the natural scale. So uselessness, in a sense, is unaccountable in evolutionary terms. It places the organism that is useless or demonstrates useless behaviours in a very ambivalent relationship to the processes of natural selection by the survival of the fittest. So uselessness has a kind of radical force that you might want to reflect upon, not just in this week and not just in this module, but more widely in your lives. What does it mean to be useless? Is uselessness a powerful act of refusal, or is it just a kind of giving up? The real. We might ponder a point of departure between Marxism and Darwinism in the role that the real plays. So Marx's theory is insistent on the fact that economic structures are distanced from the real. So towards the end of the section from Capital we're reading for this week, he writes, "So far no chemist has discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. So capitalism is not hardwired into the geological fabric of the universe. Labour is the father of material wealth. The earth is its mother." So curious gendering of this that you might want to ponder as well. And it invites us anyway to think about the role of labour in relation to the earth. What is the role of the socially constructed business of work under capital with the kind of material pre-existence of the world that we arrive into. And this reminds me of a very favourite quotation of mine from Frederick Jameson that illustrates the way in which capitalism by the late 20th century into 21st century has come to appear as a first order of reality, and ecology has come to appear as a second order of reality. So it seems to be easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of the earth and of nature than the breakdown of late capitalism. So it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So this presupposes that capitalism functions as the real, whereas the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the kind of the ground we walk on is secondary to capitalism. But ecology might lead us to a different perspective, and insisting that whatever capitalism does, it is grounded, it is ultimately related to the ecological functioning of the world we live. So actually, Jameson's quotation is kind of a joke, because really the opposite is true. You can't have capitalism without the world, and so this is, if you want to continue despoiling the world at the current rate that it's going, you need to find another planet to live on, because this planet materially, ecologically cannot sustain it. Things for you to ponder for the workshop. Bring a commodity to class and prepare a short written statement deciphering its hieroglyphic. That's a quotation you've picked up from Marx, by referring to Marx's terminology. Don't bring your phone. Well, you can bring your phone, but just don't talk about your phone. So do put a bit of thought into this. Do think about a commodity that's going to enable us to think in a creative and academically rigorous way about the material we're working with. We're not just comparing phones here. Choose something that you've got something interesting to say about. Do give it some thought. We're also going to talk formally and rigorously about commodity fetishism. So think about what commodity fetishism is, and choose a passage where Marx talks about this and bullet point the key ideas there. So bring a commodity, not your phone, think about commodity fetishism, bullet point a passage. That is that. Goodbye.
Bye.